Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Black Cultural Archives for the second of our panels commemorating the uprisings which took place here in Brixton and across the UK in 1981. I'm Aisha Johnston, the Learning and Engagement Manager at BCA. 1981 is also a special year for BCA, as it is the year that we were founded, and our beginnings are very much intertwined with the uprisings and the social and political backdrop of the times. This evening's panel will discuss the impact of the 1981 uprisings and the conditions which preceded them on art, literature, and culture. We will examine how activism during and after the uprisings influenced the emergent practices of writers, artists, and cultural producers in the UK, and the legacy of 1981 on Black creative production. Before I introduce our chair for the evening, I have a couple of notes on housekeeping. The discussion will be for approximately an hour, and you're invited to put your questions in the chat throughout the event, and the chair will endeavour to put them to the panel as we go along. And if that's not possible, they will be saved for the end. We regret that we were unable to secure live captioning for this evening's event. However, the event is being recorded and will be captioned and then released on our YouTube channel for you to watch that way. So I will now introduce our esteemed chair, Lydia Ayami Hiraidei, and she is a doctoral researcher in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her research thinks intersectionally about contemporary environmental activism in the UK and in France. She holds an MA in Post-Colonial Studies from the University of Kent, where she was a recipient of the Ian Gregor Scholarship. Her alma mater also includes SOAS, University of London, Sciences Po Paris, and the Conservatoire for Dance and Drama. Lydia will be introducing our panelists for the next hour. So sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you to the BCA for organising this event and for having me chair this fantastic panel. Exploring literature, art and culture in the context of Black Britain, and more specifically in the context of the uprisings in 1981, is both challenging and exciting. And I can't express how much I'm looking forward to hearing our panellists reflect on and share their thoughts around these topics tonight. I thought I'd open with some reflections of my own before I introduce our panellists. So I first came to know about the Brixton uprisings through the marvellous poetry of Linton Kwesi Johnson, which I actually discovered on YouTube when I was probably about 13. It evoked a huge deal of emotion and curiosity in me, and I longed to know more about what felt like a really significant moment for Black struggle in Britain, despite being too young to have been there in 81. Linton Kwesi Johnson's poetry offered me what felt like a window into history, and one that was really different from the one I was learning at school. And for me, this speaks to the intergenerational power of literature and art as tools of wisdom and knowledge, where the wisdom and knowledge of oppressed communities are not widely recognised or validated. They're instruments for sharing and educating where institutions of education exclude certain communities, and they're vehicles for self-narration and self-expression in contexts where marginalised communities are often spoken for or spoken over. So literature, art and culture can be thought of as fundamental for sharing stories, something that our panelist Sandra A. Agard knows an incredible amount about as a professional storyteller, writer, cultural historian, and literary consultant. And as I'm sure Sandra and indeed the rest of our panelists will speak to this evening, this sharing of stories is vitally important for how we shape our understandings of ourselves and the spaces we relate to in existing. And there's also much to say about how our stories are communicated, transformed, mainstreamed, ignored, who gets to tell these stories and how we come to hear them, aspects which impact the way that we connect to and engage with our collective pasts, presents, and futures. What I also find particularly striking is that the themes of literature and art that grapple with or come out of the resistance of the 80s seem highly relevant today. For example, our panelist Alex Weitel's novel, East of Acre Lane, foregrounds the police brutality and unemployment that disproportionately affected Black people in the era of Margaret Thatcher. And as Lester Holloway pointed out in the first panel of this series at the BCA, stop and search powers are now being used even more than in 1981. Today, Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police than white people. Yeah, that's Easterbaker Lane there. And the Black youth unemployment rate is currently around 40%, a similar rate to the time of the uprisings. So in many ways, we're not very far from the issues which are dealt with in the artistic work that comes out of 81, such as in Easterbaker Lane. And these are issues which don't pertain only to London, nor only to the UK. It's important to remember that whilst Brixton holds a particular and important place in our reflections on anti-racist struggle and resistance, it was not and is not the only site of struggle in this country. And this is something that our panellist, Professor Stephen Small, has written a lot about, especially exploring the Toxteth uprisings in Liverpool in 81. And where there is resistance, there is art. So from this view, we could think about the forming of the Black Art Group in Wolverhampton in 82, or the founding of Phoenix Dance Theatre in Leeds in 81. And it will be really interesting to hear more from our panellists about the ways that space and place inform and frame the literary and artistic work that comes out of and responds to uprising. So we come to this conversation 40 years on from 1981, with much change to reflect on, but also much continuity. And with that, it seems there is a mix of both hope and rage, as writers, artists, activists, musicians, scholars, and people who fill all or more than one of those categories at once continue to create and craft and struggle in complex, informative, and provocative ways. But that's enough from me. We're all very excited for the conversation to unfold amongst our very distinguished panellists today, who I will introduce now before I ask them to offer some of their initial thoughts and reflections on the topic of the panel. And so I'd like to welcome Sandra A. Agard, Alex Weitel, and Professor Stephen Small to our panel, who I will introduce in a bit more detail now. So Sandra A. Agard has been a professional storyteller, writer, cultural historian, and literary consultant for over 40 years. She's written numerous plays and has had work published in a variety of collections and anthologies. Sandra has recently released her first solo book, Trailblazers, Harriet Tubman, A Journey to Freedom, from Stripes Publishing. And Sandra has extensive experience teaching creative writing, having conducted hundreds of creative workshops and surgeries whilst working for Southwark Libraries and later at the Ministry of Stories in Hackney, East London. Alex Weitel is the author of several novels, some of them set in Brixton, where he grew up. Born in London of Jamaican parents, his first book, Brixton Rock, tells the story of a 16-year-old boy of mixed heritage in 1980s Brixton. Brixton Rock was adapted for the stage and performed at the Young Vic in 2010, and its sequel, Brent and Brown, was published in 2011. His second novel, Easterbaker Lane, has a similar setting and won a London Arts Board New Writers Award. A prequel, Island Songs, set in Jamaica, was published in 2005, and a sequel, Dirty South, in 2008. Alex's other novels include In the Seven Sisters, Checkers, which was written with Mark Parham, Little Bit, Crompton Nights, which was winner of the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize, and Straight Outta Crompton. Alex was awarded an MBE for services to literature in 2008. And Professor Stephen Small is a professor in the Department of African American Studies and African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's taught since 1995. He's the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, and he researches the history and sociology of Black people across the diaspora, including the US, Western Europe, the Caribbean, and Brazil. His most recent book is 20 Questions and Answers on Black Europe, published in January 2018. And his next book is tentatively entitled Inside the Shadows of the Big House, 21st Century Antebellum Slave Cabins and Heritage Tourism in Louisiana, which is to be published in 2022. Professor Small is a child of the Windrush generation, his dad having arrived in England from Jamaica in 1946. He was born and raised in Liverpool, which is the city with the nation's longest standing Black population. So after those introductions, I'm really excited to hear from you panelists, and I would like to invite you to give some of your reflections on the main topic of tonight, which is literature, art and culture and uprisings, and what this evokes for you.
Sandra first.
Yeah, okay. What does it evoke? Well, it invokes memory, it invokes hope, and you said at the beginning hope and rage. So definitely those two criterias. But I definitely think hope and survival, and the fact that we are still here, despite everything that has been thrown at us. And that we still continue to create, to be passionate about art and creativity, and that we are here. And to quote Maya, the Dr. Maya Angelou, still we rise. That's for me is important. 1981, I was actually at university, the University of Kent, by the way. I was at university, and I was with my first year, and it was Easter, and I remember coming back from the holidays to the campus, and my landlord lady was actually waiting for me in her kitchen, in the kitchen. She didn't live on the premises, and what blow accounts of the Brixton riots, as if I had been there, because I lived in London, and obviously I was going to be there. But I just told her I just saw what was on the news. I wasn't there, and when we got back on campus, all of us, all the Black students had the same experience with their landladies and landlords. They all, because they usually were not on the premises, but all of them that first day were there because they wanted to hear our blow by blow account of the riots, because they assumed we were there. And that for us, that just summed up, what they thought of us, despite that we're there at university, whatever it is. But because we were young and we were Black, and that, they knew that, they felt that we had to be there. But, so that was very interesting, that first day back after the riots. And yeah, that's all I've got to say for now.
Yeah, I think it's very important for especially young listeners to understand the context of what happened in Brixton 1981. For example, I think it was the mid-60s or maybe the early 1960s when a Black man was killed by the police in Yorkshire. Also, there was a case of a Brixton heroine, Olive Morris, who was only 17 years old at the time. In 1969, she intervened when the police were beating up a Nigerian diplomat. And I remember when her family went to try to get her out of the police cells, that her face was unrecognizable, and she was sexually assaulted, physically assaulted, brutalized. That was 1969. So there's been a long tail of woe, basically, for Black people living in Brixton and other areas. And so this is what was put in the brew that exploded in 1981. So I hope people get that context. And also, we have to remember that there were movements throughout the late 60s and 70s. Dark as Hell would print a Black newsletter. I think Linton Kwesi Johnston contributed his poetry to that, and they used to publish poetry from the West Indies and Africa also. I think John LaRose was invested in that also. So there was a political awakening, if you like. But on street level, there was a voicing of our lived lives and shared experiences through sound systems. And I remember growing up hearing sound systems like Safana B, Moambasa, Sir Coxon, and they all had microphones. They all had mic men, mic ladies, and they would basically tell the news of the day. And what's more, we used to listen to cassette tapes straight from Jamaica. And that is where I was introduced to artists like Brigadier Jerry and Papa San and Yellowman and the Lone Ranger. And so they all kind of filled me up with their political leanings. And so that kind of educated me in a way, listening to music, going to the dance halls, listening to the cassette tapes on boom boxes. And so even though I didn't receive that in established school systems, at least I got some kind of education about my African and Caribbean heritage on the streets and indeed through those newsletters.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Black Cultural Archives for giving us the opportunity to tell an alternative story to the dominant story which prevails in Britain, which basically whitewashes the protests and calls them riots, which they were not. A story which is distorted and partial and self-serving for government, for media, and for the control and domination, actually, of Black people. So I thank the Black Cultural Archives. Secondly, I'd like to take a moment to thank and recognize and pay respect to Len Garrison, who was the major impetus in the founding of the Black Cultural Archives. when it was a tiny little corner shop in Brixton. And his efforts, his determination, his perseverance, I think reflects what Sandra has called the will and the perseverance of Black people. We are here because you were there. We know that statement. But what Sandra said is, we are still here. And I would like to act even though you wish we were not here. And we know what's going on with the brutality against the Windrush generation and their descendants. I also want to say that along with his determination, Len Garrison was a gentle, caring, humanistic person who wanted a broader, more accurate, more comprehensive knowledge than that which existed in British schools. He wanted it for everybody. And I just think it's necessary to mention that and pay respect to him. In 1981, I was in Streatham, where I lived. I'd been involved in the Black People's Day of Action. I'd come from Liverpool to London to see what Black people were doing in London, because London had most Black people. I went to New Cross Massacre Action Committee led by John LaRose, and there was also a woman who was very well known in New Cross, whose name slips me. I apologize for that. Okay, who were involved. So I was there and I was watching what happened. I also was in England when it happened, when the protests developed in Liverpool 8. They called it Toxteth. No one in Liverpool 8 who was Black would go outside in Toxteth. Toxteth was a dangerous area for Black people. Okay, so I was there present, watching a lot of these things, reading about a lot of these things, exploring a lot of these things. And what I'd like to say is that this panel gives us an opportunity to fundamentally challenge the dominant explanation of these protests. Overwhelmingly, white people called them riots. The media called them riots. Newspapers and press called them riots. But they were not riots. They called them riots because they wanted to suggest they were random and chaotic. There were some people rioting, but they were a tiny number. And there were more white people involved as well. Okay. But the reason they were protests is that buildings were targeted in Liverpool, buildings that were known to be racist, that were known to be elitist. Statues were targeted in Liverpool, like the Huskisson statue, who had been absolutely central to the colonization of African people, to the transportation of African people into vicious slavery, and to the exploitation of Black women, men, and children in England. And Alex mentioned the man who was murdered in Yorkshire. That man was David Olawale. He was brutally targeted and murdered by the police. Okay, but the fact is, if you look at Liverpool, Black women, men, and children have been targeted brutally for decades, for generations, for centuries. In the 1919 race riots, which were race riots because whites attacked Black, but for several hundred years, Britain exploited, politically dominated, brutalized Black people. These are harsh words, but they are all very well documented. And what happened in 1981 was an attempt to say, we will accept this no longer. We have to use the voices that we have, just like Black people protested in the United States. And I'd like to finish this first point by saying, I suggest we think about the protests in two ways: as an end in themselves and as a means to an end. The protests as an end in themselves were designed to say, we do not accept the brutality, the racism, the discrimination. We do not accept the statues of these men who were revered and glorified and venerated, even though they enslaved us. So we are going to target these statues and these buildings that discriminate. But the protests were also a means to an end, to say that these statues, then like today, simply are the physical embodiment of wider discrimination, of institutional racism across the country, in education, in media. It's all very well documented. So when somebody like Boris Johnson says he doesn't want to hear it anymore, we expect you to say that because you don't want to hear the truth. And we have the truth. And the protests were symbolic and significant as a catalyst to raising awareness. And that's how I think about them. That's how I remember them. Thank
That's
you.
really interesting. That makes me think about the conditions of the time of the 80s and what that meant for people who were cultural and artistic practitioners. It would be really interesting to have your reflections, Sandra, Alex, Stephen, on what those conditions were like and how they informed that artistic and cultural practice.
Shall I go? Yeah. Well, there was nothing there. You had to create your artistic platform, and that's what we did. We created it. TV was the classic. When there was a black person on TV, you were running down the stairs. You were telling everybody, because it was so rare to see that. I remember when they had programs like Julia with Diane Carroll. She was a black nurse, and there were a lot of the programs were from America. So there's Julia, Diane Carroll. There was when the Fosters came out. So programs were so rare. So we had to create our own. So we had to write our own poems, and so the bookshops became important. There was Centre Prize in Hackney, where I was based, which was not only a bookshop but was a published work from the community. They had a publishing press, and that's where I and other people came as young people, and we wrote the book Talking Blues, which was one of the first books for young people to come out of that. And then we had obviously John LaRose and New Beacon Books. When I first knew the bookshop, it was one room in his house, him and Sarah White's house, and it was wonderful. And we were taken there by a teacher from school. I was very lucky at school to have some very innovative teachers who when Diana Ross came out with Billie Holiday, Lady Sings the Blues, my English teacher actually brought original Billie Holiday to the class. And that's where that for me, that was it. I was lost. It was so wonderful. So I was lucky. I know I was lucky. And then I had my parents who were into doing, black things. And we went to see Tutankhamun at the British Museum. So, I had my mum and dad were very into Guyanese culture and black. So I know I was lucky, but not everybody had that. So we had to create our own. So, and then we had in Brixton, we had Black Ink, the Black Ink Collective. And so, and Boy Glover 2 in West London, Head Start in Tottenham. So so bookshops, Book Place in Peckham. And so all these bookshops were important. Then we had the Black Art Gallery. We had Chedu. We had Sankova, these film collectives. We had Black Audio Film Collective. So that we had to do it ourselves. And you got funding, sometimes there was funding by the Greater London Arts, GLAR, and well, usually GLAR, sometimes the Arts Council, but it's usually GLAR. But most of all, we did it ourselves, and we did it. We did it sitting down at the turret, Talking Blues. We bound it together ourselves on a banding machine. Oh, it was back in the day. It was so, people typed it for us, and we did it ourselves. And it was a time where we looked to America, and the Muhammad Ali's, the Angela Davis, the Malcolm X, the Martin Luther. We did look to America, but then we had the music. We had Bob Marley, all the music that I know Alex knows a lot about because his background is the music scene. I was not allowed to go out because they had that other thing, being in a very strict household. I never went to any of the clubs or anything. It's when I got older, as such. I mean, I was one of the people who never went 4 Aces, in Hackney. I never went to what's it, the one at All Nations. But you heard these stories about these places, and you became part of it, even if you weren't part of the scene, because people used to talk, and that's the storytelling. People shared stories, and it was a vibrant time, and that's how we molded together. And then you went to these places, and you met the people, and you met your communities, and you gelled, and all these beautiful things. The Theatre of Black Women with Bernadine Evaristo and Patricia St. Hilaire. You know, I remember seeing them do their film, do their play Payaka. It was such a vibrant time, and all these things. And my sisters, Linda Agard, she was a dancer with Dance Company 7, and my other sister Brenda Agard was a photographer, and so we were doing all this ourselves. And our parents let us do all this artwork, and it was such a it was such a vibrant time with Claudette Johnston and all Ingrid Pollard and all those people have been there, and all those wonderful people. We were all part of that movement, and it was just such a vibrant time. It was very, very exciting. And we got to meet people, Cameron Brathwaite, June Jordan. We got all the Audre Lorde, James Baldwin. We got to meet. I remember Linton coming to Centerprise in the very early days, Dreadbeaten Blood, and when he recited Dreadbeaten Blood, it was just so exciting. It was the best of times. That's really
fantastic.
Yeah.
Alex, how do you respond to this idea about the conditions of 81? I know that really informs some of your work. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Many people question what came of the uprising of 81, but I think artistic expression came from that, and also politicians. And I remember, maybe Sandra does as well, that there used to be a sister, Sister Claudette. I don't know if you remember her. She would have poetry jams underneath the arches, and she would decorate the bare brick walls with designs and pictures and paintings and so on. And if you was inclined, you could go up on that little stage and just express whatever you wanted to express. The political climate of the day, dealing with racism back in the day. And it was offered a space for the likes of me to hone and practice my craft, which was invaluable. And also, I don't know if Sandra remembers this anthology. It's the first time I've actually read an actual book about Black women's experiences living in London. And that was edited by Beverly Bryan. Do you remember that, Sandra? I think that was published in 84, 85. I think it was the first book of its kind.
Yes.
And so at last we were seeing some kind of artistic expression to where women actually shared their lived experiences. And that encouraged the likes of me, because I felt at the time, okay, I'm a DJ, I'm a poet, but would I ever see my words in text or in a book? So that really encouraged the likes of me to continue. I mean, I was published many years later, but at least it gave me the seed in my head that it can happen. And it will happen, you know. So there was an artistic kind of a movement in South London. Poetry jams exploded, didn't they, Sandra?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Some of these spaces, you couldn't move. You couldn't really move. It's so packed, and people so desperate to share their lived experiences and share their artistic work. And that was all kind of entwined in the reggae culture of the day, and even the upcoming dance culture as well, because that came, didn't we? All that, what's his name? I cannot remember his name. You know, that fast beat style. Daddy, what's his name? I can't remember his name, but
Papa Levi and Papa Irie.
Yeah, that's right. Papa Levi, it's the Saxon eminent from the mid 1980s onwards. And in fact, for me, they were the most innovative DJs in the world at that point, because of Jamaica. I remember going to Jamaica and hearing all these Peter Metro. I remember going to Peter Metro dance, and he's trying to imitate Papa Levi. And what they were doing, the Saxon crew, they were expressing just like they did in the late 70s, early 80s, but they had obviously honed it and obviously crafted it, and it became a style all of their own. They wasn't looking for Jamaica, they was looking to hear what's happening here. And that was what was really impressive. And that again made me believe that maybe my artistic contribution could be worthwhile and valuable later on. And also we saw the politicians, didn't we? I remember around about the time of the riots, Paul Boateng with his magnificent afro coming in on Newsnight. I thought, I've never seen anything like that in my life. I thought, oh my God, there's a black man on Newsnight. That never happened. Never happened. I thought, wow, oh my gosh. And so, what was it, 1983, that Bernie Grant managed to become an MP for Tottenham. And I think it was, who else was there that year? Was it Diane Abbott as well?
Diane Abbott.
Of that year. And who else? I think there was 3, wasn't there?
Yeah. And Leicester.
Yeah. And so we began to get representation, which was so important, really important. And one day I remember going to the Brixton Archive Library in Minute Road, and I was just flicking through the archive material from what happened in 1981. And Sandra, I was astonished that what happened in Brixton was reported all over the world. The TASS News Agency, New Zealand, Australia, the Arab world, they all reported it. I was unaware of this in 81. I'm just a kid, you know, just caught up in it all, fighting the police. But it really made an impact. And it's so true what I think it was Dr. Martin Luther King said. He said that an uprising is the voices of the unheard. But it's still true today because they do not want to listen to us, even now. Even now they're trying to push back on many of the steps that we've made, the advances that we've made over the years. They're trying to push back. I see it in the news every day now, it's culture war. And I know we're doing it on purpose, but we have to stand strong.
Absolutely.
Like those black footballers, you know, who are being discouraged from taking any. And they insert people like Priti Patel saying, no, this is wrong. It should be booed. But no, we have to have a strong backbone and say, no, we have to do this. We have to let them know, you know, that we're fighting this and the struggle continues.
I agree. Thoroughly agree.
Thank you. I appreciate these contributions, and what you're saying is very reminiscent to me that Black people, no matter the institutional racism, we were always resisting through oral history, through our churches, through our community organizations, in spite of the racism. What I'd also like to say is in the 70s and 80s, there was widespread institutional racism, very well documented. There's institutional racism today, but it's different. It's more subtle. It's less visible, but it's just as vicious and just as virulent. Okay. So I'd like to mention that. Okay. But the other thing I'd like to mention is I'd like to bring us outside of Black London. And I'd like to suggest that the institutional racism, as bad as it was for Black Londoners, it was far worse for Black people in Wolverhampton, in Leeds, in Liverpool. And I don't want to get into the debate about who suffers most. But, you know, the majority of Black people in Britain have always lived in London, and it's always been difficult. But I'd like us to extend the story beyond London, because London, you know, does not represent Black Britain. And in some regards, London is not indicative. Black people outside London, we always went to London because that was the best that we had. Okay. So when you talk about sound systems, I went to all those sound systems. You know, my dad's Jamaican, all my family in London were Jamaican. But what about people like Maccabee in Wolverhampton? Sound systems like One a Penny in Liverpool, in Leeds. I think we should think about this in these terms too for Britain as a whole. Okay. Institutional racism back then was far more vicious. I'm talking about the black and white minstrels dressing up in black paint and white people in England laughing and joking and telling us it's wonderful. I'm talking about the gollywog on the jaw and kids making fun of us and calling. I'm talking about movies like Zulu, in which a tiny group of white men beat thousands of Africans. I'm talking about TV shows like Tarzan. And I'm talking about skinheads, violent. You know, I did an interview the other week, and this guy said to me, you know, when you were a kid in Liverpool, were you worried about statues? I said, I didn't have time to worry about statues. I was trying to stay alive. From Liverpool football matches, Everton football matches. So let's think beyond London and recognize, you know, what's going on as a whole. Okay. What I would also say is back then, the universities were far worse than they are now. They're really bad now. There's only one Black Studies degree in the whole of Europe, So but they were far worse then. And the literature that was written by scholars, people with PhDs who were supposed to be smart. My brother used to say academically smart, biased, but stupid. Okay. Those books, that literature that I was reading, it was all biased, partial, distorted, all designed to glorify the British Empire. And that's a fact. Did they do it intentionally or unintentionally? It's irrelevant. That's what they did. They were the books we were reading about Christianity, about barbaric Africans, about civilization. But what was really going on is it was political domination. It was economic exploitation of Africa, of the Caribbean. And all you have to do is read Walter Rodney, read Amy Garvey, read Aimé Césaire, read Anna Julia Cooper, read Claudia Jones, read Una Thurston. Okay, all of these people show that there was something very different going on. And in 1981, we knew very little about the history of Black people in Britain. That history was made popular by the book by Peter Fryer, who's white, in 1984, but also by people in Liverpool, June Hemfrey and Ian Law. Okay, so let me finish by saying this. Institutional racism was absolutely widespread in all arenas, and it was also documented. Black people were resisting. We had what I call irrepressible resistance. We knew intuitively that something was wrong. And when I got to university, I studied also at the University of Kent, Sandra. I left in 79, and I'd read nothing but self-aggrandizement. And then you know what happened? You know what happened? I came across a book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I said, this is different. And you know what he said in that book? He says, Europeans say they went to Africa and got slaves. No, they didn't. They went to Africa and got Africans. And Rodney asked, when does an African become a slave? First, they are a captive. And because the Europeans killed millions of them, millions of Africans were never slaves. Okay, so this was a challenge. And this, I think, is what's going on with Black culture. White culture, if I can oversimplify, has got it back to front. And Black culture is challenging it and challenging it. And this is what happened in the riots. In the protests. See, they've even got me so much that I'm calling them riots. They say it so much, you start to believe it. And let me finish with this one example. Black culture is oppositional, it's collaborative, and it's independent. It's designed to challenge the dominant explanations. Okay. When the protests happened in Liverpool, you know what Margaret Thatcher said? I really would like Black people not to self-segregate. It's back to front. They forced us into one neighborhood. And when we tried to get out, they said, no, you will stay back. We don't care how British you are. You will stay back. Okay. So, you know, I feel maybe I'm feeling the rage, but I'm trying to turn it into something productive. So Black cultural production in art, it's knowledge production. It's challenging the dominant narratives in dance, in performance, and music. By the way, Beverly Bryan just spoke 2 days ago on Windrush Day at Serendipity Organization to narrate the story of what it was like. And it's very important, as you know, that Black women narrate the story because they were there. Black women were frequently the majority in these organizations. Just ask Linda Bellos. Okay, they were there in community organizations, political and engaged, analytical, and also in intellectual. So we have to tell these stories. We have to expect that they will be resisted. I know what Kemi Badenoch has to say. We understand that, okay? But, you know, that we should expect them to resist. They want to look good. They feel guilty. And when they say to us, there is no racism in Britain, I ask myself, are they fools? Or do they think that we are the fools? Do they think they're telling the truth? Or anyway, let me stop there. No,
that's fantastic. We've got some questions and comments coming in from the audience, and I'd like to remind everyone to keep putting your questions and comments in because we'd like to hear from you as well and to put your questions to the panel. So Jay Jagne says, I was born and still live in Liverpool and took part in the uprising myself. Professor Small is telling it as it really is. And then we've got a question from Dipesh Pandya who says, do the panel feel the uprisings of 2020 have potentially created a bigger wave of possibility for systemic change in the UK relative to the potential of 1981? And what do they feel are the next steps for this accumulated energy to affect change today and in the foreseeable future?
You know, if you don't mind, I know I like to come in quickly. Jimmy Jagne is very important. Jimmy Jagne was part of the protest. He was actively involved in the protest. He was arrested and he's written extensively. And he's currently writing to challenge the dominant explanation. Okay. And I've learned so much from him and we're having conversations. On Liverpool, I'd also like to say this. The International Slavery Museum exists. And that began as the Atlantic Slave Trade Gallery. And Sandra mentioned Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou opened that gallery, which opened in 1984. And Black women and Black men made that gallery far better than it was intended. It was intended to just focus on the slave trade. And Africans in Liverpool said, Merseyside African Council said, why is the first museum? What about Africa? And we forced them. And then people said slavery in the past. We're still living in slavery in Liverpool. So we have a section. And one thing that I deeply resent is internationally, I read things like England is coming to terms with its legacy. I'm like, they're only doing it because Black people push them, because we force them. And right now, given all this furore around statues and monuments, you know what? I have a simple message. People asking me, what can we do? We really want to help. Well, and you know what I'm telling them? Go and ask Black people. Black people have been working on these things for decades, for generations, for centuries. Just ask Black people and make sure you compensate them, because you're getting compensated.
Sandra and Alex, what do you think to the question of 2020?
Well, for me, what happened in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, really frightened the establishment. I mean, we can tell from what was said in that report, that Tony Sewell report, or some people call it a Tony Sewage report. But, they want to concentrate on the statues because they're scared of the bigger question, and they're actually scared, I feel, that they don't want their children, the establishment, to study what happened in Amritsar, what happened in Kenya with the Mau Mau, what happened in the Caribbean. They don't want their children studying these narratives, these historical ugly truths of empire. They want us to turn our eyes away from that episode because they try to cover it up. They put a fig leaf in front of it. That's why they use the likes of Kemi Badenoch and I cannot remember the other's name. But you know, they use the shields, if you like, for this truth, for these hidden histories. And that is, for me, the next step. Not so much as tossing statues in harbours, but to relive these old narratives that they try to hide all the time, that they feel guilty of. So I would like my grandchildren to learn about the Mau Mau uprising. I want them to learn about what happened in Amritsar. We should be in the curriculum right now, rather than skirting away from it, just brushing past it. And I mean, I remember when I was at school, they kind of accelerated from the crop rotation right to the Second World War. I'm thinking, well, how did that happen? They missed out 400 years of empire building and basically blatant murder and exploitation of Black and brown peoples. We need to insert those narratives now. That is the big debate. Well, not the big debate, but that's what we have to concentrate our energies on, I feel. So it'd be easy for our children. Because for me, these histories are just as good for Black people as for white people. So they can grow up in a society where they understand what has happened in the past. At the moment, they're being conditioned and brainwashed to believing that they're superior in some kind of way. We need to wipe that away, erase that, and make them consider our narratives and look at it square in the face. And hopefully they will grow up and think, no, we want justice, we want equality for all.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the literature that is coming out is pushing people to do that. You can't hide the silences. You can't anymore. The Windrush scandal alone testifies to that, because morally, what's happening there is so wrong on every single level, and yet it's happening. And they're trying to, brush it under the carpet, so to speak, but it's there. It's evidence, the evidence that what they've treated the people is just so appalling. And even English people, white people are saying enough's enough. I mean, it's so blatant. And I think what's happening is that the literature, I mean, if you read something like Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is, I think should be standard, how we read Shakespeare in schools. Everybody in Africa, Things Fall Apart is standard part of their curriculum. We should read Things Fall Apart, because that book is such a small book, but yet it packs such a punch. It tells the story of everything in such clarity, using storytelling, using folklore to tell this terrible truth. And I think the literature does show that. And I think that what we need to do is, the truth is out there and it can't be covered up. I mean, what happened over the summer, last summer, and with George Floyd and everything, it was just so abhorrent. They couldn't hide that truth anymore. And I think it's important that we've always, despite what they've tried to do, we have always tried to seek the truth. I remember when I was at school, I wrote a poem, and the poem was about we who have created nothing. And it went on and on and on about Black people who've created nothing. It was a real long tirade about we as people haven't done nothing, and went on and on and on. I got an A+. Who is, I'm so excited, A+. I remember running home, shaking my paper in the air. Dad, I got A+. I remember my dad taking this. He read the poem and then sat me down and gently told me another story. And I always remember that. Yeah. So my A+, well, I wasn't really happy with my A+ after my dad had told me the other truth. But, but that's how it was. That's how it was. And we need to redress things. And it is being redressed. And I think out of the uprisings came that explosion of culture, which I referred to earlier. And it's still going on. I mean, at the moment, we've got, how many Black women, for example, are writing novels and poetry, and people are writing other things. I mean, not only about the Black trauma, but they're writing science fiction and fantasy. I remember this white woman telling me, because when I said I like writing science fiction, she told me, well, why are you writing science fiction? Black people shouldn't write science fiction. And I just, I didn't bumps on it. I didn't take any blind bit notice of what she said. And I continued to write my science fiction. And then when I do my creative writing classes, I always get my students to write a science fiction story. Nobody ever wants to do it, but they always, at the end, have enjoyed the experience. And that's it. You see, and they try to pigeonhole us to get us to write or to do certain things. And what we do, we have to think out of the box. And I think that's, as a people, that's what we are very capable of. And that's what we have always shown, that we can think outside the box. And we have done, because we are survivors. We are survivors. Transatlantic slavery, we survived that. And then what came before that? Before Africa was all chopped up, there was people there. There's Amar. He wrote a book called The Healers. Mm-hmm. Brilliant book that looks at how Africa was before it got all chopped up and and destroyed, so to speak. Mm-hmm. It's such a beautiful book. He paints such a graphic picture of Africa, how it was before. And there's the wonderful Octavia. I mean, I could go on because I love my books. Octavia Butler, Wild Seed. Oh, Wild Seed. Everybody should read that book because it paints a picture of how Africa was before. You think Wakanda was something else. Everybody should read Wild Seed because it's such a good book. It really is. And we could do a whole other thing about Octavia Butler, but I know about Octavia Butler now. But for me, it's the literature and the fact that at the moment we've got all these wonderful images about all these new books about young children's books where children finally are seeing themselves in books. Mm-hmm. Growing up for me, the book was, I have to say this, Little Black Sambo. I'm sure Alex, you remember Little Black Sambo. Terrible book. But that was the only Black book we had as children. And it was such an awful book. And I'm so happy now that there's so much more than that terrible book that was out there.
I'd like to pick up on that actually, because it's really interesting to hear you all talk about before and also to talk about now. So how do you see cultural or literary or artistic representations changing from 1981? I mean, how has the way that we tell stories changed? And especially if we think about the ways that films like the Small Axe films are now being shown in mainstream platforms. Do you feel that the way that we tell stories is changing and whose voices are being heard?
I think it's important that the Small Axe series happened. Obviously, I was part of it. But it did focus on, even though it's brilliant, I feel very blessed and proud to be part of it. It did focus on our Black trauma and Black pain. What I'd really like to see now is a total exploration of our whole lived experience, family life, entertainment, our history, our joy, everything.
Black joy.
Yes, absolutely. And so that is how I'd like it to spread out and mushroom out, if you like. And so people have access to all of our experience, not just our Black pain, because sometimes if we go too much on that, it can be like Black pain porn kind of thing. People just, look how they suffered and look how they suffered and so on. I want to at least add to that narrative so people are aware of all of our experiences. And so I really like to see more comedy. Definitely more comedy. I know there's one directed by Amil Amin that's coming out at Christmas time, a Christmas drama. I mean, when's the last time we had one of those? Probably never, I don't think. I cannot remember a Christmas drama comedies focused on Black people. Can you, Sandra?
No.
So that would be great to see. And so, again, I just like to see the explosion of all this art rather than just focus on our pain and our trauma. That'll be, and that goes for film, theatre, and so on. So I'm really looking forward to that. Especially, I want to hear the narratives of these young people who went on those marches and their experiences in universities and schools and their political activism and so on. I really like to read their stories now. Even though, yes, I'm 58 now, but it'd be lovely to see that the baton being passed down so they could share their lived experiences and share that to the world, and the world accessing those stories as well, which is very important because we've been excluded for so long. I mean, there's all this conversation and debate about Channel 4, but really, they've not been living up to the remit they had.
No, absolutely
not at all.
Not
so
at all.
They failed us as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, they got there and then dropped us.
Yes, absolutely.
I'd like to come in if I can have a chance.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. Compared to the 1970s and 80s, there's a far greater variety of Black voices, which capture a far greater range of our experiences in terms of women, in terms of gays, increasingly in terms of transgender. But I'd like to see all the things that Alex and Sandra said. But again, I'd like to see us go even broader. And what I'd like to suggest is this: we are limited by our English language. And that there are vast numbers of Black people for whom English is not the first language. I work in the Netherlands, and I once gave a lecture in which I said, the British captured Jamaica, and that's why I speak English. But I could just as well be speaking Dutch or Spanish or Portuguese or French or Danish. So what I'd like to suggest is that, yes, Sandra said we need to think outside the box. And what I thought is, they've tried to put us into a box, a Eurocentric box. But we've always thought outside the box. It's just that we don't have the power and we don't have the resources and we're pushing it. So there's a far greater variety of Black voices now than ever before. But what I'd also like to say is we draw on the USA, and I live in the USA, and being here with Black people in a Black studies department has also saved my mind. But there's more Black people in Africa than anywhere outside Africa. And there's more people of African descent in Brazil than in the whole of the US. There's twice as many in the Caribbean. There are more Black people in the Caribbean that speak Spanish and Creole than English. So I know it's a difficult issue. I know people in Britain are a bit inward looking in terms of English, not accusing you. Okay. But this literature exists and it's growing and it's developing. Okay. I also want to say something about statues. Okay. The University of Liverpool has just renamed one of its halls after Dorothy Kuya. It was named Gladstone Hall. And I'm a member of that committee. And it took 9 months to change it. Okay. And I say it's about time. So the statues, as Alex said, are not the be all and end all, but like the protests, I think they're important for raising these other issues. And whether we rename them, whether we remove them, whether Oxford said they're going to remove Rhodes and then changes its mind, they are there as a catalyst to recognize that there are other issues. If every statue was removed, Gary Young said, let's remove everything. if everything was removed, education would just be as bad. 60 or 70% of British people think the British Empire was a good thing. I just can't understand that, other than to think they've been brainwashed. Gladstone was one of the biggest exploiters of Africa that ever existed. His father got more money for enslaving children, women, and men than anyone else in Britain. He was a multimillionaire, and he used that money to send his son to Eton and Oxford to become prime minister 4 times and to pretend that he was in favor of the abolition of slavery. I make that as a provocation. And it's taken years by people like Nathaniel Tobias Coleman, black people in Liverpool, students, to get the statue, to get the name of the hall changed. And now the university is looking at Tate. It's looking at Lever. And my argument is that beyond the statues, we need to look at access to education for women, resources for childcare, so they can have better access to jobs. We need to look at diversifying staff. And there are people like Gloria Hyatt and Maria O'Reilly and Michelle Charters and Claire Dove and many other people in Liverpool who are challenging those issues. So I think things are better than before. They're not as good as we deserve. And Windrush and before them, Africans, we are the ones that built Britain. And we've been exploited a long time before Windrush arrived. So what's happening to Windrush, which, as Sandra said, is absolutely horrifying and appalling, they've been doing that to us for decades, for generations, and for centuries. And we are continuing to fight back, continuing to challenge their arguments, continuing to challenge their assumptions. And just because Kemi Badenoch says this government is against critical race theory, you can say that. We're not just going to be quiet. We never have been quiet. We're not quiet now, and we never will be quiet. And black people will be here forever.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
It's really interesting to hear you all talk about kind of who has the power to tell stories. Mm-hmm. I'd be interested to know more about how you understand the political importance of storytelling as an act for Black resistance.
Well, I'll say quickly,
okay.
In broad terms, it's oppositional, it's collaborative, and it's independent. Black women and men have always known the stories we hear intuitively, they're wrong. So we've written stories in opposition to the dominant. So Bernard Cole and the education of the sub-education of Black children, the deliberate institutionalization of any, we write in opposition. Ray Costello, who's the most accomplished writer on Black Liverpool, has written in opposition to dominant narratives that show the ways in which African men were exploited. Okay, Black women have written many, many things, but not so much in books. Black women in Liverpool and across the country have done interviews, narratives, poetry, autobiographies, biographies. So it's oppositional to say we refuse to be what you want us to be. There's Bob Marley. That was my political education. I heard nothing good in school until I got to reggae. And then I heard, you know what I heard? It no good to stay in a white man's country too long. And it got me thinking, and I'm still here. Okay, so it's oppositional. It's collaborative. What do I mean by collaborative? Black storytelling is a collaboration between Black people and non-Black people, between Black people and Asians and other people working together. It's also a collaboration between academics and non-academics. Universities keep Black women and men outside. So Black women and men outside have developed storytelling, like Sandra, like Alex, but they often work in conjunction with academics like me. An academic is just my job. I was Black before I was an academic. I was a child of the Windrush before I was an academic. Okay, and I work with the Black Europe Summer School, which is a 2-week program meeting right now in Amsterdam that challenges the dominant explanation. So the academics that tell the story about Black people, they say Black people are immigrants. They're assimilating. They should show gratitude. We say, no. Black people are citizens. We're not assimilating. We've been dealing with racism. Black people have been Black citizens in Liverpool for centuries. Oppositional, collaborative, and independent Black people telling stories, telling poetry like Sandra and Alex, deciding what's more important, like Alex is saying, let's broaden it. Let's not follow their agenda. Let's emancipate ourselves from mental slavery.
Mental slavery.
You think a British school ever told me that? No, forget that. Okay, so this is what I think stories is: poetry, dance, performance. Van Lee Burke has all these photographs in Birmingham. Fantastic alternative story. Jean Binter Breeze, I remember seeing here in the 1980s. Okay. Last thing I want to say is this. I live in the US. Black Americans helped save my mind. Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael. But I'd like us also to look at Black Europe. I asked a friend of mine, black women in London, and I said to her, when black people look outside the UK, do they still spend 90% of their time looking at the US? She said, no, it's not like that. 99% of their time. And it's good and it's wonderful, but there are people in Denmark like Jeanette Ehlers, who's a performance artist, who tells a fantastic performative story about legacies of slavery and violence. There's an organization in Berlin called Each One Teach One. There's the Black Archives in Amsterdam. So I want us to look more and more at this. And let me finish with a set of facts to get you thinking. Black people in Britain suffer. I know we suffer. And we compare ourselves with the US. And Bernie Grant used to say, look, you always compare yourself with the US. You're always going to look bad. You can never have what the US has. Okay, what the US has. Right now, there are tens of thousands of politicians in Europe. Tens of thousands. And I can find only 30 black people. 30 nationally elected, 30 in the 46 nations of Europe. And 18 of those 30 are in England, mainly in London. What does that mean? So that means one country, England, has 18 national politicians, and 45 nations at least have another 10. And I'm not saying it's good or it's bad. I reserve my judgments. I want to say this is a fact. And if black people compare ourselves with Europe, you get a different story than if you compare yourself with the USA or with Brazil or with Cuba.
Yeah. And sometimes there is a price to pay for speaking or writing your truth. Lydia, in her introduction, spoke warmly about Issa Rae Lane. And when the book was published, it was reviewed well everywhere, even in the right-wing newspapers. But was it offered up for any major awards? No. On the year of publication, was I invited to any of the major festivals in the UK and beyond? No. And so even film development, it was with the BBC for a number of years and Channel 4. Was it greenlit? No, it was termed too political. It might not suit. Middle England was one comment a drama commissioner made. And so there's always a price to pay for speaking the truth. I mean, we accelerate forward now to, just yesterday, again, the right-wing establishment are attacking Meghan Markle for daring to speak her truth. And so there's lots of hurdles we have to hurdle over. To sometimes I think we don't even need their validation. We should speak our truth anyway, despite what they say about us, despite the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and a host of other. They must be frightened now because they developed this new news station, haven't they? Overseen by Andrew Neil. They've got a whole raft of right-wing commentators to appear on these programs. So we know we got them rattled because they know their time is coming to an end. Because these young people, and this is why I have faith in the future, these young people who marched, they were different shades to the group of us, the thousands of us who marched on that day of action. You remember it, Stephen? It was, I hardly saw any white faces that day. Hardly any. The only white faces I say were in the angry faces of the policemen who basically tried to provoke us when we tried to cross Blackfriars Bridge. But when I look across the world, I see young people engaging in our struggle, in our narrative, and saying enough is enough. This is why they commissioned Tony Sewage to complete his report, because they are scared, they are rattled. They are kind of creating these culture wars to try and stir up their right-wing base, but it's going to fail.
Yeah, because the truth is out there. The truth is there. I mean, we people are talking about Tulsa. People are talking about the Bristol bus boycott.
Yeah.
People are talking about all these hidden truths that have always been there, but they hide it. And I I do remember because I was on that march, 1981, and when we got to Fleet Street and being spat upon and cussed, it was awful. It was just so terrible. And when they were, and then the next day, the Sun newspaper, Black Rampage.
Yeah, that was disgusting.
That was disgusting.
Disgusting.
Where? There wasn't anything like that. And but the truth is out now, coming to light. And
the young
people. Sorry,
Sandra. It enrages me because today they have not changed.
No. They
still attack us.
They're still exactly when the young people who marched after what happened in America to George Floyd, and all the Black Lives Matter, and about the statues, and it's all just a front to hide the deeper truth.
Mm-hmm.
About the Zong, and that a lot of these institutions they started through slavery. They started through exploiting men, women, and children. And it's just, it beggars belief, really, that they can still be getting away with telling these terrible, terrible untruths. But I think people are fighting against this, and these truths are coming out despite what they're saying, because it's so evident. We have, as I said, the terrible Windrush scandal and all that what they're doing to the people, and all the other truths are coming out. And the fact, when I was at, the fact that Stephen, you said there's only one place that now teaches some kind of Black studies. I know Goldsmith has a course. I did African and Caribbean studies, English and African and Caribbean studies at Kent. That's what I did all those years ago, and I know that course is no longer there. I don't think that course is no longer there, and then that's and it's a terrible indictment.
Something happened and I got muted. I don't know if that's those folks. I got muted, so thank you. Look, I'd like to suggest something else. Alex, you're right. Well, let me phrase it this way: the majority of people on that march were Black, but there were white people there. There definitely were white people there, and Darker's how made it clear that white people should not be at the front, whether they liked it or not. Okay, so what I like to suggest is, we're talking about us and them in general terms, but clearly the Black population is stratified. You guys are so lucky to have Kemi Badenoch as your member of parliament. That's sarcasm. You're so lucky to have Kwesi Kwarteng. Okay, the Black population, the white population is stratified too. And no more so than in Liverpool, where there's been so-called interracial marriage for decades, for generations. And so I want us to think about that stratification. Okay, I want us to think about the ways in which so-called left-wing and Marxists challenge the dominant system. And the truth is, in my experience in Liverpool in the 70s, we didn't have Black bookstores. We didn't have New Beacon. We didn't have the Huntleys. We didn't have, that's the way it goes. Okay, but you know where we got our literature? From Marxist bookstores. They had their agenda around class and so on and so forth, but we still got them from there. So that's something that we should do. I think we're going to close. Again, I just want to thank and respect Len Garrison for, making sure the Black Cultural Archives was set up. Thank you for everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I hope we've stimulated some thought. And remember, Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So they're not going to go quietly. Okay. But, we don't give up. We'll continue to struggle. And, I believe we should welcome all allies that share our values to make this society more just, more fair, more equitable for everyone, particularly Black people.
As Stephen said, we're coming to the close, but I want to pose one more question from the audience that we've got. The question's from Jimmy Jagne. It's, what are the panelists' thoughts and feelings on the scarcity of literature on the uprisings, and written from the perspectives of the Black communities directly affected by this history?
Well, if you want, I can comment. Thanks, Jimmy, for that question. We know there's more white people in Britain than Black people. We know there's more white people in universities than Black people, than Black women. Okay, they have the majority. They have the resources. However, there are a small and growing number of people I'd like to see more panels like this that challenge the notion that they were riots and that actually they were protests, that challenged the centuries-long, British attempt, rather successful for a while, to exploit us. So we're concerned about it. We want to see more people. But again, we have to build up in steps. We can't do everything at one time. So we want to see more. And here's what I would say. Somebody asked me, if you had to recommend one piece of reading, what would it be? And I'm absolutely clear. It would be Discourse on Colonialism by Ayami Césaire. It's only about 20 papers. It's one of the most powerful pieces that I've ever read. So that's what I'd suggest. So, the story of the protest is not complete. It hasn't been told in full. It's not accurate. I'm still reading books talking about race riots. It wasn't a race riot. There were white people alongside black people. So we want to see more. Oh, by the way, I should do a bit of promotion. I see Alex promoting his book. Well done, Alex. I just wrote 8 articles on the uprisings across Britain. Those articles are available on the website of Writing on the Wall, a community arts and literature organization in Liverpool. And what they do is they put the uprisings in context across the country, and also looking at the history of African migrants and African citizens in Britain before the Windrush. So they're free and available. Thank you to Writing on the Wall, to Madeleine Hennigan and her colleagues.
Yeah. I'd really like to concentrate our focus on lobbying, and this is for everybody, whether you're send your kids to a primary school, secondary, colleges, university. There needs to be a concentrated effort to make sure that our important text that tells of our experiences, tells of our history, our stories, to be inserted into those curriculums, whatever level it may be. We really need, that's the next stage in the fight for me, to include our narratives in those spaces. For me, that's going to be a hard fight because, as Stephen says, we're not going to give away easily, or if not at all. So we really have to fight for that. That's the next big step, I believe. So everybody needs to address that, I feel.
Definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think the books the books have still to be written. I mean, a lot of these books, be it the children's books, young people's books, and for adults, they are still to be written. But but there are books, the Walter Rodneys, C.L.R. James, that tell us the histories, come a Brathwaite. Yeah. Those books are out there. The Chebbies, the Amars, the poetry of Jean Binta Breeze or Linda Kwesi Johnston, and your books, Alex. The writing of Mallory Blackman, all those books are out there, and the truth will out. There's the music books of Lloyd Bradley, so those books are out there. But I think, in answer to the question, I think more books are yet to be written. As such, I think. I mean, Alex. I mean, you talk about in your books about the Brixton riots, but maybe you need to write some more.
Well, can I say one last thing? I'll tell you what I'm going to do next. I'm going to ask Rhoda for the emails of Lydia, Sandra, and Alex, so that when I come to England, I'm going to look you up and hang out with you, so I can.
Absolutely.
Because we need these panels. It broadens my mind. I have my narrative, but Sandra gave me examples of groups I didn't know about, bookstores. Alex, I loved Lydia's introduction. I've recorded that. I'm not going to plagiarize it, but I'm going to share it. So thanks.
Maybe you can show me around Liverpool to all the important places that I should know about.
Absolutely. I can do better than that. I can introduce you to Jimmy Jagne, who'll be delighted to show you around, and to other groups. And when you come to Oakland, I'll give you a tour of Black Panther and Black feminist sites.
That'd be wonderful.
I can't guarantee a meeting with Angela Davis.
That'd be wonderful.
I'll try.
So on that note, I think I'll also extend my thanks to the panel. I've also learned a huge amount this evening in conversation with you. I wish we could continue forever, but we can't. So yes, I just want to say thank you, Sandra, Stephen, and Alex. And I hope everybody enjoyed watching this conversation and engaging with it. And yes, I'm going to hand back to Aisha now, and I wish you all a good evening.
And thanks to Aisha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha and
Thank
Lydia.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. A massive thank you to all of you for an extremely enjoyable discussion. And thank you to our audience for contributing your questions. As I mentioned at the start, the event will be released with full captioning for later viewing. But before we sign off for the night, I'd like to quickly promote our Black Lens Film Festival in partnership with altafrica.com and the BFI. The Black Lens Festival 2021 celebrates new Black filmmaking talent with screenings and events. So our first will be on Friday the 16th of July at 6 p.m. with a UK premiere of How to Stop a Recurring Dream, followed by Q&A with director Ed Morris and actress Ruby Barker. The link will be posted in the chat, but also you can visit our website events to find out more about that. Once again, Stephen, Sandra, Alex and Lydia, thank you so much for your time this evening and for sharing your reflections with us on these important events. It's been refreshing and inspiring. Thank you and good night.